"Get rid of it. I don't need an heir from a nobody nurse," Hyun Malchin said, his voice cold as the steel of the gun he carried. 3 years later, he saw her standing in the rain with 3 small children. And when the sleeve of one child's jacket slipped, revealing a dark crescent-shaped birthmark on the wrist, the exact mark Malchin had hidden beneath his custom suits his entire life. For the first time in his existence, the most powerful man in Seoul couldn't breathe. The thick envelope of cash landed on the polished desk between them like a death sentence. $200,000 that were supposed to erase 6 months of stolen moments and a future that would never exist. Harriet Billings had rehearsed this moment in the hospital break room for 4 days, imagining every possible way to tell him, picturing his sharp features softening into something like tenderness, maybe even vulnerability from a man who'd built an empire on showing none. But instead, he stood with his back to her, staring out at the Seoul skyline spread below like scattered jewels, his silence more devastating than any threat he'd ever made. She pressed her palm against her stomach, still flat, still hiding 3 lives she didn't even know about yet. Gone was the man who'd gripped her hand during the emergency surgery she'd performed in the dead of night, who'd looked at her like she was the only person in the world who could save him. Now there was only the heir to the Hyun syndicate, a man raised from birth to value power over people, control over connection. He said this was the solution to everything, that the money would cover the procedure, relocation expenses, and enough for her to start over somewhere far from Seoul, somewhere his rivals would never find her, somewhere she'd never be a weakness to exploit. She asked him about the nights in the recovery room, about the promises, about that evening 2 weeks ago when he'd held her face in his hands and said he'd never met anyone as fearless as her. And he answered with a single sentence that shattered everything. He said he'd only told her what she needed to hear. She was nobody, an orphan who'd been raised in state homes with nothing, a nurse who'd lost her position the moment the hospital discovered she'd been hiding a wounded syndicate boss in the private ward. And now, she was losing the only man who'd ever made her feel like she mattered. She walked out into the rain, leaving the envelope untouched on his desk, her hand pressed against her belly as she whispered to the life growing inside that they would survive. She didn't know how, but they would make it, and someday he would see what he'd thrown away and it would destroy him. If this story makes your heart beat faster, hit that like button. Share it with someone who believes in second chances and subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Because 3 years from now, when Hyun Malchin sees those triplets for the first time, everything he thought he wanted will turn to ashes in his hands. Harriet didn't remember how long she had walked through the rain that night, only that when she finally stopped, her clothes were soaked through and her feet had carried her to Incheon International Airport on the outskirts of Seoul. She stood there shivering in the fluorescent glow, staring at the departure board flickering with the names of cities she had never seen. Portland, Oregon. The name leapt out at her like a lifeline, as far as she could go with the money left in her account, as far as possible from Seoul, from the Hyun syndicate, from the man who had just reduced her heart to nothing. She bought the ticket in cash, left no trace, didn't look back, and boarded the nearly empty flight at 3 a.m. with swollen eyes and both hands still pressed protectively to her stomach. Harriet took a window seat, leaned her head against the cold glass, and watched the lights of Seoul shrink little by little until they vanished completely beneath the clouds. She wasn't crying anymore. The tears had dried up hours ago, leaving only emptiness and a slow burning resolve in her chest. She thought about Malchin, about the ice in his eyes when he turned away, about the sentence that had killed everything, and she swore to herself that this would be the last time she allowed any man to decide her worth. The flight lasted 13 hours, cutting across continents she knew only from textbooks, stopping once in Lowe's Angels where she bought cheap crackers and forced herself to swallow despite the bitterness clawing at her throat. When the plane finally touched down in Portland the following morning, Harriet stepped off on numb legs and looked around the unfamiliar coastal city as though she were staring at an entirely new life. She found a cheap boarding house near the waterfront, paid for a week with nearly all the money she had left, and lay down on a bed that smelled of salt air, allowing herself for the first time to think about the future. She had no job, no references she could use, no family to call, and a pregnancy she couldn't afford. But she had survived worse. She had survived the foster system, survived being unwanted, survived saving the life of a man who should have been her death sentence. And she would survive this too. She pressed her hand to her stomach and made a promise in the silence of that small room. Whoever was growing inside her would never feel abandoned, would never question if they were wanted, would never have to earn love the way she had spent her entire life trying to earn it. 3 months later, during a winter storm that knocked out power across the entire city, Harriet gave birth to triplets in a small coastal hospital with a midwife who barely spoke English. 3 perfect children, 2 boys and a girl, each with Malchin's sharp features, and something else she didn't notice until the nurse cleaned them and handed them to her one by one. A dark crescent-shaped birthmark on each tiny wrist. The same mark she'd glimpsed once on Malchin's wrist when his custom shirt sleeve had ridden up during the surgery. She stared at those 3 identical marks and felt something crack open in her chest, not grief this time, but a fierce, protective rage. He had called them a problem to be solved. But they were perfect. And they were hers. She registered them under her middle name, Sullivan, gave them names that meant strength, hope, and light, and began the long, exhausting work of building a life from nothing. For 3 years, Harriet worked 3 jobs, morning shifts at a medical clinic, afternoon shifts at a pharmacy, and weekend nights waitressing at a seafront restaurant. She slept 4 hours a night, survived on coffee and determination, and watched her children grow into bright, curious, impossibly beautiful reflections of a man who would never know them. She told herself she'd moved on. She told herself she didn't think about him anymore. She told herself the anger had faded into something manageable. But then, 3 years to the day after she'd walked out of his office, Harriet saw Hyun Malchin again. And everything she'd built came crashing down. Harriet didn't remember choosing the name Nora Sullivan. It simply appeared on the employment application she filled out at the Harbor Medical Clinic 3 days after arriving in Portland, her hand moving across the paper as though someone else controlled it. The woman interviewing her, a tired-looking administrator with kind eyes, never questioned the lack of references, never asked why a qualified nurse from Seoul would wash up in a coastal Oregon town with nothing but a duffel bag and desperation in her eyes. She just looked at Harriet's swollen ankles, made a note about adjusting the schedule for prenatal appointments, and said she could start Monday doing intake processing and basic patient care. The pay was half what she'd earned in Seoul, but it came with something more valuable: anonymity. Nora Sullivan had no past, no connections to wounded syndicate bosses, no history of performing emergency surgery in hospital wings that should have been empty. Nora Sullivan was just another single mother trying to make it in a city where people minded their own business and asked few questions. The clinic work filled her mornings, 6 to noon, processing patients who came in with fishing injuries, respiratory infections from the damp climate, and the occasional tourist who'd underestimated the Pacific's cold currents. She moved through the routine with mechanical efficiency, her mind always half somewhere else, calculating how many more weeks until the baby came, how much she'd need saved, whether the boarding house would let her stay once she had an infant to care for. She didn't know yet that there would be 3. The ultrasound that revealed the triplets came during her 5th month, at a free clinic across town, where she'd gone because the technician didn't require identification. She'd lain on the examination table, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, when the technician's hand stilled on the wand and her expression shifted into something Harriet couldn't quite read. 2 heartbeats became 3. One future became something entirely different. The technician asked if there were multiples in her family, and Harriet said she didn't know, which was true. She'd never known her parents, never had medical history to reference, never had anyone to ask. The technician printed out 3 grainy images and tucked them into an envelope with information about high-risk pregnancy resources. her voice gentle as she explained that Harriet would need to stop working soon, that carrying triplets required rest and proper nutrition and medical supervision she clearly wasn't getting. Harriet thanked her, took the envelope, and went directly to the pharmacy where she'd been picking up weekend shifts filling prescriptions. She asked the owner, an elderly Vietnamese man named Mr. Din who ran the place with his daughter, if she could increase her hours. He looked at her the way the clinic administrator had looked at her, seeing something in her face that made him nod before she'd even finished explaining. He said she could work afternoons, 1 to 6, doing inventory and handling the register when things got busy. The daughter, Lynn, showed her how to use the outdated computer system and where they kept the supplies, her hands moving quickly as she talked about her own children, about how hard those first years had been, about how you survived by just putting one foot in front of the other until suddenly you looked back and realized you'd walked miles. Harriet nodded and said nothing about the triplets, nothing about Seoul, nothing about the man whose genetic legacy was multiplying inside her with every passing week. The boarding house room became too expensive once she stopped being able to hide the pregnancy. The landlord's wife took one look at Harriet's expanding belly and informed her that crying bobbies would disturb the other tenants, that she'd need to find somewhere else before the birth. Harriet packed her few belongings into the same duffel bag she'd arrived with and found a basement studio in a converted house near the waterfront. The space was barely larger than a closet, with a ceiling so low she could touch it while standing, but it had its own entrance and a landlord who accepted cash and didn't ask questions. She bought a used crib from a church sale and 3 second-hand infant carriers from a thrift store run by women who smiled at her stomach and told her she was glowing. She didn't feel like she was glowing. She felt like she was drowning, working 2 jobs while her body stretched and ached, lying awake at night doing calculations that never quite added up, trying to figure out how she would care for 3 newborns while earning enough to keep them fed and housed. The restaurant job came during her 7th month, when the medical bills from the high-risk pregnancy appointments started arriving in envelopes she was afraid to open. A seafront place called The Anchor hired her to waitress Friday and Saturday nights, 4-hour shifts that turned into 6 or 7 when the kitchen got backed up and customers lingered over their meals. The owner, a gruff man named Dale who'd lost his wife to cancer the year before, never commented on her pregnancy except to tell her to sit down when things were slow and to take home whatever food the kitchen hadn't sold. She served tourists who came to watch the sunset over the Pacific, couples celebrating anniversaries, families with children who reminded her of everything she'd never had. Her feet swelled until she could barely fit them into her shoes. Her back screamed with every tray she carried. But she smiled and took orders and pocketed tips that meant the difference between paying the electric bill or sitting in the dark. The triplets came during the worst winter storm Portland had seen in 15 years. Harriet's water broke while she was walking home from the pharmacy, 3 blocks from her basement studio, the wind so fierce it nearly knocked her sideways. She made it to the small coastal hospital where she'd been receiving prenatal care, gripping the reception desk as contractions tore through her, and a midwife named Ruth who barely spoke English guided her into a delivery room where the lights flickered every time the wind screamed against the building. 14 hours of labor that blurred into a single endless moment of pain and fear and determination not to give up, not after everything she'd survived, not when she was this close. Ruth held her hand and spoke in broken English mixed with Spanish, telling her to breathe, to push, to trust that her body knew what to do even when her mind wanted to surrender. The first baby came just after midnight, a boy with Malchin's sharp features and a cry that filled the entire room. The second came 20 minutes later, another boy, quieter but no less perfect. The third came at dawn, a girl who emerged into the world as the storm finally broke and pale winter light flooded through the window. Ruth cleaned them, weighed them, wrapped them in hospital blankets that were too large for their tiny bodies. And then she placed them in Harriet's arms one by one, and Harriet stared at their faces through tears she couldn't stop, seeing Malchin in every feature, every expression, as though he'd stamped his identity onto them so completely that she could never escape him. But then Ruth pointed to their wrists, to the small dark marks shaped like crescents, identical on all three Bobbies, and asked if Harriet had the same birthmark, if it ran in her family. Harriet looked at those marks and felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd seen that mark once, maybe twice, when Mal Chin's custom shirt sleeve had ridden up during the surgery she'd performed. A crescent moon on his wrist, dark against his skin, distinctive enough that she'd noticed it even in her exhaustion and fear. She'd thought it was a tattoo then, but this was genetic, hereditary, unmistakable proof of exactly whose children she'd just brought into the world. The man who'd called them a problem had branded them with his bloodline before they'd even been born. Ruth registered the births under the name Sullivan, as Harriet requested. She gave them names that had nothing to do with Seoul or syndicates or the father who would never know them. Owen, meaning young warrior. Felix, meaning lucky and happy. And Iris, meaning rainbow, because after the storm came light, after darkness came color, after everything Mal Chin had destroyed came something beautiful and entirely hers. The hospital kept her for 3 days, teaching her to nurse 3 Bobbies, to change them, to recognize their different cries and needs. Other mothers had visitors, had partners bringing flowers, had family members arguing about whose eyes the baby had inherited. Harriet had Ruth, who brought her extra blankets and showed her how to swaddle the triplets so they felt secure, and a social worker who left pamphlets about assistance programs and food banks and support groups for single mothers. She took the pamphlets, thanked them all, and walked out of the hospital with 3 carriers strapped to a stroller someone had donated, heading back to a basement studio that suddenly seemed impossibly small for 4 people. The first month passed in a blur of sleeplessness and feeding schedules and constant fear that she was doing everything wrong. Owen cried the most, demanding attention with a fury that reminded her of his father. Felix watched everything with solemn eyes, as though trying to understand the world before committing to it. Iris slept the best, but woke with a smile that broke Harriet's heart every single morning. She went back to work when they were 6 weeks old, finding a woman in her building who watched infants in her apartment for cash. Mrs. Kowalski was 70 years old with hands that shook from arthritis, but she'd raised 5 children and buried a husband and told Harriet that Bobbies needed love more than they needed perfect conditions, that they would be fine as long as someone held them and fed them and sang to them, even off-key. Harriet paid her half of what she earned at the clinic and tried not to think about how many things could go wrong while she was gone. The 3-job routine became her life. Mornings at the clinic processing patients and administering basic care, always watching the clock because she had exactly 45 minutes to pick up the triplets from Mrs. Kowalski and get them home before her afternoon shift at the pharmacy. Afternoons doing inventory and filling prescriptions, while the triplets slept in carriers behind the counter, Mr. Din and Lin taking turns holding whoever was fussy. Speaking to them in Vietnamese and English, and the universal language of grandparents who'd seen it all. Weekend nights at the Anchor, where Dale let her bring the triplets on slow nights, setting up the carriers in the back office where she could check on them between tables, where regular customers started asking about them by name and leaving extra-large tips when they heard she was raising 3 alone. She slept 4 hours a night, sometimes less. She survived on coffee and the meals Dale sent home from the restaurant and the bone-deep knowledge that she couldn't afford to fail, couldn't afford to be weak, couldn't afford anything except absolute determination to give these children something better than what she'd had. The triplets grew. They started smiling, then laughing, then reaching for things with those small hands that all bore Mal Chin's crescent mark. They learned to roll over, to sit up, to babble in sounds that would eventually become words. Owen remained fierce and demanding. Felix remained thoughtful and observant. Iris remained joyful, finding delight in everything from the rain against the window to the mobile Harriet had hung above their shared crib. She told herself she'd moved on from Seoul, from the Hyun syndicate, from the man who'd reduced her to nothing with a single sentence. She told herself the anger had faded into something manageable, something she could carry without it destroying her. But late at night, when the triplets finally slept and she lay on her mattress on the floor staring at the ceiling, she thought about Mal Chin and wondered if he ever thought about her, if he ever regretted the choice he'd made, if he had any idea what he'd thrown away. She thought about those crescent birthmarks and knew that someday, somehow, he would see them. And when he did, everything he'd chosen over them would turn to ash in his hands. The penthouse overlooking Seoul's financial district had cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes, but Hyun Mal-chin barely noticed the view anymore. Floor to ceiling, windows displayed the city like scattered diamonds below, the Han River cutting through the urban sprawl in a dark ribbon that reflected neon and streetlights. He stood at those windows most nights, whiskey in hand, telling himself he'd made the right choices, that power and control were worth more than whatever fleeting emotion he'd felt for a nurse whose name he tried not to remember. 3 years had passed since he'd placed that envelope on his desk and watched her walk away into the rain. 3 years of expanding the Hyun empire, of securing alliances, of consolidating power until his word carried weight in boardrooms and back alleys alike. 3 years of marriage to Yoo-jin, the daughter of the Daejeon syndicate boss, a union arranged to merge 2 criminal empires into something formidable enough to dominate the entire peninsula. The marriage had been strategic perfection on paper. Yoo-jin brought connections to political figures and legitimate business fronts that made money laundering effortless. Her family's distribution networks complemented his protection rackets and real estate holdings. Together, they presented an image of unified strength that made rivals hesitate and allies eager to curry favor. But the penthouse felt like a mausoleum, beautiful and empty and cold. Yoo-jin occupied the master suite on the opposite end of the apartment, a space Mal-chin hadn't entered in months. They maintained separate lives within the same expensive walls, crossing paths only when business required it, when public appearances demanded the performance of marital unity. She attended charity galas on his arm, smiled for photographers, played the role of devoted wife with an actress's skill. Behind closed doors, she barely spoke to him, spending her time with shopping trips and spa appointments, and whatever lover she was currently entertaining while he traveled for business. He told himself he didn't care, that emotional attachment was a weakness he couldn't afford, that the hollow arrangement served its purpose even if it provided nothing resembling companionship. But late at night, when the whiskey burned down his throat and the city sprawled below like proof of everything he'd achieved, he thought about Harriet. About the way she'd looked at him in that hospital room when he was bleeding out from a rival's ambush, her hands steady and sure as she performed surgery with equipment she'd stolen from supply closets. About the fierce determination in her eyes that night, the refusal to let him die even though saving him put her career and possibly her life at risk. He'd convinced himself what they had was nothing, just convenience and proximity, and the temporary bond that forms between people in crisis. He'd told her what she needed to hear because that's what the situation required, because letting her believe in something more would have been crueler than the clean break he'd delivered. That's what he told himself anyway, during the hours when guilt tried to surface, and he drowned it with expensive alcohol and deliberate forgetting. The marriage to Yoo-jin had been finalized 6 months after Harriet left. A lavish ceremony at the Shilla Hotel, 500 guests from Seoul's criminal elite and corrupt political establishment, coverage in gossip magazines that portrayed it as the wedding of the year. Mal-chin had stood at the altar in a custom suit that cost more than he'd offered Harriet to disappear, repeating vows he didn't mean to a woman he barely knew, sealing an alliance that expanded his power considerably while leaving him feeling nothing at all. The wedding night had been perfunctory and cold, Yoo-jin making it clear that she understood this was business, that she expected him to maintain discretion with whatever mistresses he chose to keep, that she would do the same with her own arrangements. They'd shared a bed exactly twice in 3 years of marriage, both times when her father had made pointed comments about wanting grandchildren to secure the family legacy. No pregnancy had resulted from those encounters, and neither of them had seemed particularly disappointed by the failure. Mal-chin walked away from the window and refilled his glass, the whiskey bottle already half empty, though it was barely past midnight. The penthouse was silent except for the muted sounds of traffic far below and the mechanical hum of climate control keeping the temperature precisely regulated. Somewhere in the master suite, Yoo-jin was probably asleep or on the phone with whoever currently held her interest. He didn't know and didn't ask, maintaining the same careful distance she'd established from the beginning. His phone buzzed with a message from his second-in-command, updates about a shipment that had been delayed at Blasian port, about bribes that needed to be distributed to ensure customs looked the other way. He responded with terse instructions and set the phone aside, staring at the black mirror of its screen and seeing his own reflection distorted and unfamiliar. The empire he'd built was everything he'd been raised to value. His father had controlled the heroines syndicate with an iron grip until a heart attack had put him in the ground 5 years ago, leaving Malchin to inherit both the organization and the philosophy that power was the only thing that mattered. That sentiment was weakness, that a true leader sacrificed personal desires for strategic advantage. He'd internalized those lessons completely, or thought he had, until Harriet's face appeared in his mind at unexpected moments, and he wondered what would have happened if he'd chosen differently that day in his office. The pregnancy had been a complication he couldn't afford. His father's associates were already questioning whether he was strong enough to lead, whether his age, he'd been only 29 when he took control, meant he lacked the ruthlessness necessary to command respect. Having an illegitimate child with a foreign nurse would have been ammunition for rivals, proof of poor judgment and uncontrolled appetites, a weakness they could exploit. The marriage to Eugene had neutralized those concerns, demonstrating that he understood dynasty building required strategic unions rather than emotional entanglements. Her family's support had silenced the critics and expanded his influence into territories that had previously been contested. But it had cost him something he couldn't quite name, something that made the whiskey taste like ashes and the penthouse feel like a prison despite its luxury. Eugene emerged from the master's suite around 1 a.m, dressed in a silk robe that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She barely glanced at him as she crossed to the kitchen, retrieving a bottle of imported mineral water from the refrigerator with the practiced efficiency of someone navigating familiar territory. She asked if he was coming to the gallery opening tomorrow, her tone suggesting she didn't particularly care about the answer. Some artist her mother supported, something about modern interpretations of traditional Korean aesthetics, the kind of event where being seen mattered more than actually viewing the artwork. He said he had meetings in Blasian, which was true, though he could have rescheduled if he'd wanted to attend. She nodded and took a drink of water, her expression revealing nothing, a mask she wore so constantly he wondered if she even had a genuine emotion left beneath it. She mentioned that her father had called again about grandchildren, about how the alliance needed heirs to secure the future, about how their continued failure to produce offspring was becoming a source of concern among the family elders. Her voice was clinical, discussing reproduction like a business transaction that had fallen behind schedule. Malchin said nothing, staring into his whiskey as though it held answers he couldn't articulate. Eugene studied him for a moment, something almost like curiosity crossing her face before the mask returned. She asked if he ever regretted the arrangement, if he ever wanted something different, her question coming from nowhere and leading nowhere. He told her the arrangement served its purpose, that personal satisfaction was irrelevant compared to strategic positioning. He used the exact words his father would have used, the philosophy that had been drilled into him since childhood. She laughed, a sound without humor, and said they were perfect for each other then, two people playing roles so convincingly they'd forgotten there was anything underneath. She went back to the master's suite without waiting for a response, leaving him alone with his whiskey and the view of a city he controlled, but couldn't actually touch. The next day he went to Blasian, handling the port situation personally because delegating it felt like admitting he had nothing better to do. The shipment was weapons, crates of them purchased through shell companies, and destined for a conflict in Southeast Asia where both sides paid well for equipment with untraceable origins. The customs officials accepted their bribes with practiced efficiency, and the shipment cleared without incident, adding another transaction to the empire's growing accounts. He returned to Seoul on a private helicopter, watching the landscape unfold below, thinking about how far he'd come from the young man who'd bled out in a hospital wing while a nurse he barely knew saved his life. That version of himself felt like a different person entirely, someone who'd briefly believed in something beyond power and control, who'd held Harriet's hand in the recovery room and told her she was the most courageous person he'd ever met. He'd meant it at the time, or thought he had, before reality reasserted itself and reminded him that survival in his world required eliminating vulnerabilities rather than indulging them. The pregnancy had been a vulnerability he couldn't afford. The termination had been a logical solution to an impossible problem. The money he'd offered had been generous, far more than necessary, evidence that he wasn't completely heartless even if his decision seemed cruel. That's what he told himself, anyway, constructing justifications that sounded reasonable in the abstract, but felt hollow when he actually examined them. The penthouse was empty when he returned, Yujin having left for the gallery opening without bothering to confirm whether he'd changed his mind about attending. He stood at the windows again, the city spreading below in its usual sprawl of light and darkness, and felt the weight of everything he'd chosen pressing down like physical force. His phone showed messages from associates, from politicians on his payroll, from business partners who needed decisions only he could make. He responded mechanically, maintaining the empire that had become his entire existence, wondering when exactly achievement had started feeling like emptiness. He thought about Harriet walking out into the rain, about the way she'd looked at him when he'd reduced their relationship to a transaction, about the child, or possibly children, he'd never asked about multiples, that she might have brought into the world despite his demands. The thought should have concerned him, should have triggered the strategic thinking his father had valued above all else. An illegitimate heir wandering around somewhere could be a liability, could be leverage for enemies who discovered the connection. But instead he felt something else, something closer to regret than fear, something that made him wonder what would have happened if he'd chosen differently that day in his office. The whiskey bottle was empty by the time Yujin returned from the gallery, her heels clicking across the marble floors as she headed directly to her suite without acknowledging his presence. He heard her door close, heard the lock engage, and felt the absolute silence of the penthouse settle around him like a shroud. This was what he'd chosen. This beautiful, empty, powerful existence where every decision served the empire and nothing served the parts of himself he'd systematically eliminated because they represented weakness. His father would have been proud. The thought made him pour another drink from a different bottle, standing at the windows as dawn began to break over Seoul, washing the city in pale gray light that made everything look tired and worn. Somewhere in the world, Harriet might be waking up too, might be facing her own morning in whatever life she'd built from the ruins he'd created. He'd never searched for her, never tried to confirm whether she'd followed through with the termination, never allowed himself to wonder if there was a child out there carrying his genetics. That would have been weakness, would have been sentiment, would have been everything his training had taught him to avoid. But standing in his empty penthouse, while his hollow marriage continued in the suite down the hall, while his empire expanded into territories that meant nothing beyond the accumulation of more power, Malchin allowed himself one moment of absolute honesty. He'd made a mistake that day in his office. He'd chosen wrong, and no amount of whiskey or strategic success or deliberate forgetting would ever change that truth. The International Medical Innovation Gala wasn't the kind of event Hyun Malchin typically attended, but Yujin's father had investments in several pharmaceutical companies being honored that evening, and appearances at legitimate business functions helped maintain the veneer of respectability the syndicate required. So he found himself in a rented tuxedo that cost more than a luxury car, standing in the grand ballroom of the Paradise City Hotel in Incheon, pretending to care about breakthrough treatments and revolutionary surgical techniques while scanning the room for useful connections. Yujin worked the crowd with practiced efficiency, her arm linked through his only when photographers were present, otherwise drifting toward clusters of wealthy socialites and corporate executives whose favor her father sought to cultivate. She wore a gown that had required 3 fittings and cost enough to fund a small hospital wing, her hair swept up to display diamond earrings that caught the light with every movement. They looked perfect together, He knew, the image of power and sophistication that magazines loved to feature in their society pages. The ballroom was excessive even by Seoul's standards. Crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across marble floors, ice sculptures melting slowly at the center of tables laden with food most guests wouldn't touch. A string quartet played in one corner while servers circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, the whole affair reeking of wealth deployed to demonstrate importance rather than accomplish anything meaningful. Malchin accepted a glass of champagne he wouldn't drink and tried to look engaged as a hospital administrator explained the new cardiac wing being funded by corporate donations. The man spoke with the enthusiasm of someone who believed money could solve any problem, who had never watched someone bleed out because a hospital lacked basic supplies, who lived in a world where medical care was a commodity rather than a desperate struggle. He was nodding at appropriate intervals, his mind already calculating how long he needed to stay before leaving would be acceptable, when he saw her. At first he thought exhaustion was playing tricks on him, that the combination of jet lag from a trip to Hong Kong and the whiskey he'd consumed earlier was creating hallucinations. Because the woman standing near the far wall, partially obscured by a pillar and deep in conversation with someone he couldn't see, looked exactly like Harriet Billings. The same profile, the same way of holding herself, the same subtle mannerisms he'd cataloged during those weeks in the hospital when she'd saved his life, and he'd convinced himself what he felt was gratitude rather than something more dangerous. His attention fragmented completely, the administrator's voice fading to meaningless noise as Malchin tried to get a clearer view without being obvious about it. The woman turned slightly, responding to something her companion said, and the movement gave him a full view of her face. It was her. 3 years older, her features slightly sharper as though hardship had refined rather than broken her, but unmistakably Harriet. She wore a simple black dress that looked professional but inexpensive, her hair pulled back in a practical style, no jewelry except small silver earrings. She stood out among the glittering excess surrounding them precisely because she looked like someone who had better things to do than attend galas. The administrator was still talking, something about donor recognition and community partnerships, but Malchin's entire focus had narrowed to the woman across the room who shouldn't be here, who should be in America or Australia or wherever she'd gone after walking out of his office, who definitely shouldn't be in Incheon at an event populated by exactly the kind of people he'd warned her to avoid. He excused himself with words he didn't fully register, moving through the crowd with the kind of deliberate casualness that drew no attention. Years of operating in spaces where showing interest could be fatal had trained him to approach targets without telegraphing intent, to cross rooms without seeming to have a destination. She was talking to a Korean woman in her 50s, someone Malchin vaguely recognized from hospital fundraising committees, their conversation appearing to be about medical research based on the brochures they were examining. Harriet's expression was polite but distant, professional courtesy masking what looked like profound discomfort with the entire situation. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she would notice him in her peripheral vision, far enough that approaching him would be her choice. For several seconds she didn't react, continuing her conversation as though she hadn't registered his presence, and he wondered if he'd miscalculated, if 3 years had been enough for him to become just another stranger in a crowd. Then she went completely still, her hand freezing in the act of pointing to something in the brochure, her entire body language shifting into a tension he recognized from the night of the surgery when she'd realized exactly who she was treating. The woman she'd been talking to noticed the change, following Harriet's gaze to Malchin and immediately brightening with the kind of recognition that came from seeing someone important. She started to say something, probably an introduction, but Harriet cut her off with practiced politeness, excusing herself with a fabricated reason that sounded plausible enough not to cause offense. She turned away from him, moving toward the far exit with the controlled speed of someone who desperately wanted to run but knew better than to draw attention. Malchin followed, maintaining the same measured pace, aware that Eugene was somewhere in this room, and that being seen pursuing another woman would create exactly the kind of scene that benefited no one. Harriet made it to the exit and through into the corridor beyond, a wide hallway lined with conference rooms currently dark and unused. She was walking quickly now, heels clicking against polished floors, and he called her name quietly enough that it wouldn't carry but loud enough that she would hear. She stopped walking but didn't turn around, her shoulders rising with an inhale he could see even from behind. For a long moment neither of them moved, the silence broken only by muted sounds from the gala filtering through the closed doors. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was carefully blank, the same professional mask she'd worn when dealing with difficult patients or hospital administrators. But her eyes gave her away, showing a mixture of emotions he couldn't fully parse, anger certainly, and something that might have been fear, and beneath it all something that looked like the same hollow ache he'd been carrying for 3 years. She asked what he wanted, her voice controlled despite the tension in her posture. The question was simple but loaded with everything unspoken, 3 years of silence and assumed endings suddenly confronted with the reality of proximity. He didn't know how to answer because he hadn't thought past the impulse to follow her, hadn't considered what he would actually say if given the opportunity. The prepared words from his world, threats or negotiations, or the kind of cold pragmatism that served him in business, felt completely inadequate to this moment. So instead he asked what she was doing here, in Korea, at this specific event where their paths had no logical reason to cross. She laughed, a sound without humor that reminded him of Yoo Jin's empty responses to questions about their marriage. She said she worked here, that she'd taken a position at a medical research facility in Incheon 6 months ago, that attending fundraisers was part of her job responsibilities even though she hated every minute of them. The information hit him like a physical blow. 6 months. She'd been in Korea for 6 months, less than an hour from Seoul, moving through a world that occasionally overlapped with his, and he'd had no idea. He asked why she'd come back, why she would risk returning to a place where his influence could reach her, where the danger he'd warned her about 3 years ago was still very real. Her expression hardened, the professional mask cracking enough to show the anger beneath. She said she'd come back because the research position was the best opportunity she'd been offered, because she'd spent 3 years building a career from nothing and refused to let fear of him dictate her choices, because maybe she was tired of running from a man who'd made it clear she meant nothing to him. The last part was delivered with enough bite that he felt it, the accusation sharp and justified and completely deserved. He started to respond, to offer some defense of decisions that felt increasingly indefensible, but movement at the end of the corridor interrupted him. Yoo Jin appeared, scanning the hallway with predatory awareness, her expression neutral but her body language suggesting she'd noticed his absence and come looking. Harriet saw her too, recognition flickering across her face as she processed the expensive gown and confident bearing of a woman who clearly belonged in spaces like this. She looked between them, understanding dawning, and something in her expression shifted from anger to something colder and more final. She asked if that was his wife, her tone making it clear she already knew the answer. He could have lied, could have deflected, could have used any of the manipulation techniques that served him in business negotiations. But standing in front of the woman he'd spent 3 years trying to forget, with his hollow marriage approaching down the corridor, dishonesty felt pointless. He confirmed it, watching Harriet's face for reactions she wouldn't give him, seeing only that same careful blankness that hid everything important. She said congratulations, the word dripping with sarcasm, and turned to leave just as Yoo Jin reached them. Yoo Jin's gaze moved between them with calculating assessment, taking in Harriet's simple dress and lack of jewelry, the tension in Malchin's posture, the obvious history crackling in the space between them. She asked in Korean who this was, her tone polite but her eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that had made her dangerous long before their marriage. Malchin introduced Harriet as a former medical professional he'd encountered through business, the explanation vague enough to be meaningless, formal enough to suggest insignificance. Harriet's expression flickered with something that might have been pain before the professional mask returned. She excused herself in flawless Korean that surprised both of them, thanking Yoo-jin for the introduction with perfect formal politeness before walking away down the corridor without looking back. Yoo-jin watched her go, her expression thoughtful. She commented that the woman seemed familiar, that perhaps they'd met at a previous medical event, her tone casual but her attention focused in a way that suggested she'd filed away this encounter for future reference. Malchin said he didn't think so, redirecting the conversation toward the gala and whether they'd accomplished the networking her father had requested. Yoo-jin allowed the deflection, linking her arm through his as they returned to the ballroom, but he felt her awareness like a blade against his ribs, sharp and dangerous and perfectly controlled. The rest of the gala passed in a blur of meaningless conversations and strategic positioning. He saw Harriet once more, across the crowded ballroom, talking to the same hospital committee member from earlier. She didn't look in his direction, didn't acknowledge his presence, moved through the remainder of the evening as though their encounter had never happened. But when he and Yoo-jin finally left, climbing into the back of a town car while photographers captured their departure, Malchin found himself staring out the window at the hotel's receding lights and thinking about the look on Harriet's face when she'd asked if Yoo-jin was his wife. Not anger, though she would have been justified in that. Not surprise, because she'd clearly already suspected. Just a kind of weary resignation that suggested she'd expected nothing better from him, that he'd simply confirmed what she already knew about his character and priorities. Yoo-jin was silent during the drive back to Seoul, her phone occupying her attention as she responded to messages and scrolled through the evening's social media coverage. But as they pulled up to the penthouse, she commented almost casually that the nurse seemed like someone from his past, someone who perhaps mattered more than a business acquaintance. He said she was reading too much into a brief interaction, that the woman was no one important. Yoo-jin smiled, an expression that never reached her eyes, and said that was interesting because his face had suggested otherwise, that she'd never seen him look quite that unsettled by anyone. She left him sitting in the car with that observation, walking into the building alone while he stayed behind and tried to process what had just happened. Harriet was in Korea. She was in Incheon. She was moving through a world that occasionally intersected with his, which meant this wouldn't be the last time they encountered each other. The thought should have concerned him strategically, should have triggered calculations about risk and exposure, and maintaining the careful separation he'd established. Instead, all he could think about was the look in her eyes when she'd walked away, and the hollow ache in his chest that 3 years and a strategic marriage had done nothing to eliminate. The obsession started the morning after the gala, manifesting as a compulsion Malchin couldn't rationalize or control. He told himself he needed to assess the security risk, to understand why Harriet had returned to Korea, and whether her presence represented a liability he needed to manage. He told himself it was strategic thinking, the kind of preemptive intelligence gathering that had kept him alive in a world where information meant survival. But the truth, which he couldn't quite admit even to himself, was that seeing her again had cracked something open inside him that 3 years of deliberate forgetting had barely managed to seal. He assigned one of his most discreet operatives to follow her, a woman named Jae-woo who specialized in surveillance that left no trace. The reports came back detailed and thorough, painting a picture of Harriet's life that should have been routine, but instead felt like a catalog of everything he'd destroyed. She lived in a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood near the research facility, a 4th-floor walk-up in a building that had seen better decades. She worked long hours, arriving at the lab before dawn and often staying past dark, her research focused on pediatric cardiac conditions. She ate lunch at her desk most days, brought coffee from home in a battered thermos, wore the same rotation of professional clothes that had clearly been purchased for function rather than fashion. The reports mentioned nothing about a child, no evidence of the pregnancy he demanded she terminate, and Malchin felt something unclench in his chest that might have been relief or might have been disappointment. He told himself it didn't matter either way, that her choices after leaving his office were none of his concern, that he was simply gathering information to ensure she posed no threat to his interests. Then Jae-woo's report from the 3rd day, included a detail that stopped his breath. Harriet had been observed at a small park near her apartment complex, accompanied by 3 children approximately 3 years old. 2 boys and a girl, identical in age, clearly triplets based on their matching features and synchronized movements. They'd spent an hour at the playground while Harriet sat on a bench watching them with the kind of exhausted vigilance that suggested she was responsible for their care. Malchin read the report 3 times, his hands steady despite the way his pulse had accelerated. Triplets, 3 years old. The timing aligned exactly with when Harriet would have given birth if she'd ignored his demands and continued the pregnancy. He told himself it was coincidence, that she could have moved on with someone else, that there was no logical reason to assume these children had anything to do with him. But even as he constructed rational explanations, he knew he was lying to himself with the same deliberate blindness he'd practiced for 3 years. He needed to see them. The compulsion was illogical and dangerous and completely counter to every principle his training had instilled, but it overwhelmed strategy and caution until nothing else mattered. The next Saturday, he drove to the park Jaiwoo had mentioned in her report, parking his car 3 blocks away and approaching on foot like a criminal stalking a target. He wore casual clothes purchased specifically for this purpose, a baseball cap pulled low, sunglasses despite the overcast sky. The disguise was probably unnecessary. Nobody in this neighborhood would recognize a syndicate boss who moved exclusively through wealth-insulated spaces, but old habits of operational security demanded precaution. The park was small and poorly maintained, the playground equipment showing rust and wear, the grass patchy and brown in places where too many feet had worn it down. A handful of other parents scattered across the benches, most absorbed in their phones while children played. And there, on a bench near the swings, sat Harriet. She looked exhausted in a way that went beyond simple tiredness, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from sustained struggle without relief. Her clothes were clean but worn, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her attention fixed on 3 children who were currently arguing over turns on the slide. Malchin positioned himself behind a tree where he could observe without being easily seen, feeling ridiculous and desperate and unable to stop himself. The children were beautiful, even from a distance, their features sharp and distinctive in a way that made his chest tighten with recognition he wasn't ready to acknowledge. One of the boys was demanding and vocal, insisting he should go first down the slide with the kind of imperious certainty Malchin recognized from his own childhood. The other boy was quieter, watching his siblings with thoughtful assessment before making his own careful descent. The girl laughed at something, the sound carrying across the playground, pure and joyful in a way that seemed impossible given the circumstances Jaiwoo's reports had described. Harriet called to them, her voice carrying notes of affection and authority mixed with exhaustion. She told them they had 10 more minutes before they needed to go home for lunch, and the announcement triggered a chorus of protests and negotiations that she handled with patient firmness. Malchin watched them interact, these 3 small lives moving through their Saturday morning, completely unaware that their existence had just shattered every certainty he'd built over the past 3 years. He told himself he still didn't know for certain, that physical resemblance wasn't proof, that he needed to stop making assumptions based on coincidental timing. Then the vocal boy fell, tripping over his own feet in his eagerness to reach the swings. He landed hard on the packed dirt, and his immediate wail of pain brought Harriet rushing over with the other 2 children trailing behind her. She knelt beside him, checking for injuries with the practiced efficiency of her medical training, her voice soothing as she examined scraped palms and a bruised knee. The other children pressed close, the quiet boy offering commentary about whether it looked serious while the girl patted her brother's shoulder in sympathy. Harriet pulled a small first aid kit from her bag. Of course she carried one. That was exactly the kind of person she was, and began cleaning the scrapes. She pushed up the boy's sleeve to check his elbow, and that's when Malchin saw it. A dark crescent-shaped birthmark on the child's wrist, distinctive and unmistakable, identical to the mark Malchin had carried his entire life hidden beneath custom shirt sleeves and expensive watches. the mark his father had called the Hyun brand, a genetic signature that appeared on every male in their bloodline and occasionally on females, passed down through generations as proof of ancestry and belonging. His vision tunneled, the entire world reducing to that small crescent on a child's wrist, while everything else faded into meaningless background noise. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what he was seeing beyond the simple, devastating fact of its existence. Harriet finished bandaging the scrapes and helped the boy to his feet, and in the process, Malchin caught a glimpse of the other boy's wrist. The same mark. And when the girl reached up to brush hair from her eyes, her sleeve shifted enough to reveal the crescent on her wrist, too. All three of them. All three children carried the Hyun birthmark, the genetic proof that no amount of denial or strategic distance could erase. They were his. The thought hit him like physical trauma, breaking through every defense he'd constructed, every justification he'd rehearsed, every lie he'd told himself about making the right choice. These children existed despite his demands, despite the money he'd offered, despite every pressure he'd applied to make Harriet erase them from existence. And she'd raised them alone. Jaiwoo's report suddenly recontextualized into something unbearable. The modest apartment wasn't minimalist preference, but financial necessity. The long work hours weren't career ambition, but survival requirement. The worn clothes and packed lunches and careful budgeting weren't choices, but the reality of a woman supporting 3 children on a researcher's salary, while he sat in a penthouse worth more than she would earn in a lifetime. He watched Harriet gather the children, preparing to leave the park, her movements efficient despite obvious exhaustion. She spoke to them with patience that had to be learned rather than natural given the circumstances, correcting behavior and answering questions, and managing 3 distinct personalities with the kind of attentiveness that required constant emotional labor. The vocal boy, Owen, Malchin would later learn from deeper investigation, complained about leaving, and Harriet negotiated with him in a tone that suggested this was a frequent battle. The quiet boy, Felix, asked whether they could have the good noodles for lunch or if it was a rice day, a question that made Harriet's expression flicker with something that looked like guilt before she promised the noodles. The girl, Iris, simply took her mother's hand and asked if she could help cook, her eagerness suggesting she didn't understand that a 3-year-old's help would make everything take longer. Harriet promised they could all help, her voice warm despite the exhaustion etched into every line of her face, and began walking them toward the park exit. Malchin stood frozen behind his tree, watching them leave, 3 small figures trailing after a woman who'd somehow built a life from the wreckage he'd created. The crescent marks on their wrists felt like accusations, like proof of every failing choice he'd made, like evidence that couldn't be disputed or rationalized away. He'd called them a problem to be solved. He'd offered money to make them disappear. He'd stood in his office with his back turned and told their mother she was nobody, that she'd served her purpose and should take the cash and vanish from his life. And she'd walked away into the rain, pregnant with triplets carrying his genetic legacy, and built a life that involved working multiple jobs and skipping meals, and raising his children in a 4th-floor walk-up while he'd married for strategic advantage and expanded an empire that suddenly felt completely meaningless. The shame hit him like a wave, followed immediately by something more dangerous. The overwhelming need to fix this, to somehow undo 3 years of their struggle, to prove he wasn't the monster his choices had made him. But what could he possibly offer that wouldn't insult everything Harriet had survived? What could he say that wouldn't sound like empty words from a man who'd already demonstrated exactly how much his promises were worth? He walked back to his car in a daze, his mind churning through possibilities and discarding them as inadequate. Money would be an insult. Apologies would be meaningless. Any attempt to insert himself into their lives would be met with justified resistance from a woman who had every reason to hate him. The drive back to Seoul passed in a blur, his hands steady on the wheel while his thoughts spiraled into chaos. By the time he reached the penthouse, he'd made one decision with absolute clarity. He needed to know everything about these children, about their lives, about what they needed, and whether there was any way to provide it without causing more harm than he'd already inflicted. Yujin was out, probably with her latest lover, leaving the penthouse empty and silent. Malchin poured himself a drink he didn't want and stood at the windows overlooking the city, seeing nothing but 3 small figures with crescent marks on their wrists. His children. The ones he'd called a problem. The ones who'd survived despite him, not because of him. The ones who were growing up in poverty while he lived in luxury, who wore worn clothes while he owned custom suits, who negotiated about noodles versus rice while he'd never worried about food scarcity in his entire life. The walls he'd built around his heart, the defenses that had allowed him to function for 3 years without confronting what he'd done, collapsed completely. And for the first time since that day in his office when he'd made the worst decision of his life, Hyun Malchin allowed himself to feel the full weight of his failures. The intelligence came through Malchin's network 3 days after he'd seen the birthmarks, delivered in a routine security briefing that suddenly became anything but routine. His head of intelligence, a former NIS operative named Sang-uk who'd been on the Hyun payroll for a decade, presented surveillance intercepts from a rival organization based in Busan. The Choi Syndicate, longtime competitors who'd been probing for weaknesses ever since the marriage alliance with Yoojin's family had shifted the power balance on the peninsula. The intercepts mentioned a woman in Incheon, a researcher with connections to the Hyun organization, possibly leverage that could be exploited. The reports included grainy surveillance photos taken with telephoto lenses, and Malchin's blood went cold when he recognized Harriet's face among them. Sang-uk continued his briefing, noting that the Choi operation seemed exploratory at this stage, basic intelligence, gathering rather than active threat, probably trying to identify vulnerabilities they could exploit if tensions escalated into open conflict. He recommended monitoring the situation, but didn't assess it as an immediate concern, just another data point in the endless chess game of syndicate politics. Then he pulled up another photograph, this one taken at the playground, showing Harriet on the bench while 3 small figures played in the background. The image quality was poor, the children's faces partially obscured, but their presence was unmistakable. Sang-uk asked if Malchin knew who the children were, his tone professionally neutral, and Malchin felt the lie form automatically before he consciously decided to tell it. He said the woman was a former medical contact, that he'd encountered her recently at a fundraiser, that the children were probably unrelated to any security concerns. Sang-uk accepted this with a slight nod, but his expression suggested he'd filed away the evasion for future reference. He moved on to other briefing items, other threats and opportunities that demanded attention, while Malchin's mind spun with calculations that had nothing to do with the rest of the meeting. The Choi Syndicate was watching Harriet. They'd photographed the children. They were gathering information about connections to the Hyun organization, trying to map vulnerabilities and identify pressure points. Which meant they were 3 steps away from discovering that those children carried Hyun blood, that they represented exactly the kind of leverage rival syndicates dreamed of exploiting. The meeting ended, and Malchin dismissed Sang-uk with instructions to increase surveillance on Choi operations, to flag any additional intelligence about the Incheon situation, to treat this as priority monitoring. Sang-uk agreed and left, and Malchin immediately pulled up everything his network had on the Choi organization's current operations. What he found made his hands clench into fists. The Choi Syndicate had been expanding aggressively into territories the Hyun organization controlled, testing boundaries and pushing into markets that had previously been uncontested. The marriage alliance with Yoojin's family had blocked their growth in Seoul, forcing them to seek advantages elsewhere, to find weaknesses they could exploit to shift the balance of power. An illegitimate heir would be perfect leverage. 3 illegitimate heirs would be catastrophic. If the Choi discovered the children's connection to him, they could use them as hostages, as bargaining chips, as proof of poor judgment that would undermine his authority within his own organization. They could threaten the children to force concessions, or worse, eliminate them to prevent future succession disputes. The danger wasn't theoretical or distant. It was immediate and concrete, and entirely his fault for not considering this possibility 3 years ago when he'd made decisions based on pride rather than strategic thinking. He needed to move them somewhere safe, somewhere his enemies couldn't reach them, somewhere fortified enough to withstand threats he'd spent his entire life learning to anticipate. But approaching Harriet directly would trigger exactly the kind of visibility he needed to avoid. If he showed up at her apartment or her workplace, if he made any overt move that demonstrated the children mattered to him, it would confirm suspicions and paint a target on their backs more effectively than any surveillance photo. He needed a different approach, something indirect that would provide protection without exposing the connection. The solution came from an unlikely source, Yoo-jin. She'd been quieter than usual since the gala, watching him with an assessment that felt more clinical than suspicious, as though he were a puzzle she was systematically solving. 2 days after the intelligence briefing, she cornered him in the penthouse kitchen while he was attempting to drink coffee and pretend the world wasn't collapsing around him. She said she'd done some research on the woman from the gala, that medical researchers in Incheon weren't difficult to identify, that Harriet Billings had an interesting employment history with some notable gaps. Her tone was conversational, almost friendly, but her eyes were sharp with the intelligence that made her dangerous. Mal Chin said he didn't know what she was talking about, maintaining the lie with practiced ease. Yoo-jin smiled, the expression not reaching her eyes, and said she'd also noticed the Choi syndicate had suddenly taken an interest in medical facilities in Incheon, that their surveillance patterns suggested they were tracking someone specific, that it seemed like quite a coincidence. She asked if the woman and her children needed protection, the question delivered with such casual directness that Mal Chin's carefully constructed denial crumbled before he could reinforce it. He asked what made her think there were children. Yoo-jin pulled out her phone and showed him a photograph she'd clearly obtained through her own intelligence network. Harriet at the playground with the triplets, the image clearer than the Choi surveillance photos, detailed enough to show the children's faces. She said she wasn't stupid, that she'd seen his face at the gala when he'd looked at that woman, that she'd watched him become progressively more distracted over the past week in ways that suggested personal crisis rather than business concerns. She'd put the pieces together, the timing, the children's ages, Harriet's sudden departure from Seoul 3 years ago, and arrived at conclusions he couldn't dispute. Mal Chin started to respond, to offer some explanation or denial, but Yoo-jin held up her hand to stop him. She said she didn't care about the emotional dimensions of whatever history he had with this woman, that their marriage was a business arrangement, and she had no illusions about fidelity or romance. But she did care about vulnerabilities that could threaten the alliance between their families, about enemies discovering leverage that could be used against the Hyun organization, and by extension against her own family's interests. If the Choi syndicate realized those children existed, if they understood the connection, it would create exactly the kind of weakness that led to bloodshed and territorial losses, and everything both their families had worked to prevent. So she was going to help him protect them, not out of sentiment, but out of strategic necessity. The offer was so unexpected, delivered with such cold pragmatism, that Mal Chin could only stare at her while she outlined a plan that demonstrated she'd been thinking about this longer than he had. The research facility where Harriet worked had been seeking expanded funding for a new pediatric wing. Yoo-jin's family had pharmaceutical investments that could easily justify a major donation, the kind that came with influence over facility operations and security protocols. They could install proper security systems, hire guards who were actually competent rather than the minimum wage contractors currently employed, create barriers that would make surveillance and infiltration significantly more difficult. For Harriet's apartment, Yoo-jin suggested a sudden vacancy in a building her family owned in a better neighborhood corporate housing that was supposedly being held for visiting executives, but could easily be made available to a valued researcher. The building had security, controlled access, cameras that actually worked. And if the Choi syndicate continued their interest, well, Yoo-jin's family had their own intelligence network, and could ensure that any moves against the woman or children would be detected and neutralized before they became threats. Malchin asked why she would do this, what she gained from protecting his illegitimate children. Yujin's expression was utterly cold as she explained that she gained stability, that she gained insurance against the kind of vulnerability that got people killed in their world, that she gained leverage over him because now he would owe her something that couldn't be easily quantified or repaid. But mostly, she said with something that might have been the first genuine emotion he'd ever heard from her, she gained the satisfaction of knowing she was better than him, that she could show basic human decency toward innocent children, while he'd apparently been content to abandon them to poverty and danger. The assessment landed like a blade between his ribs, accurate and devastating, and completely deserved. He asked what she wanted in return, because nothing in their world came without price. Yujin said she wanted him to stop pretending their marriage was anything other than what it was, to stop maintaining the fiction that they were building something together beyond a strategic alliance. She wanted honesty, at least in private, and she wanted him to acknowledge that she'd saved his children's lives because he'd been too much of a coward to do it himself. The terms were harsh but fair, and Malchin accepted them with a nod that felt like surrender. The plan moved forward with the kind of efficiency that came from having unlimited resources and no ethical constraints. Yujin's family announced a major donation to the research facility within 48 hours, the kind of philanthropic gesture that got covered in business news and made administrators grateful enough to accept any recommendations about facility improvements. The security upgrades began immediately: new cameras, professional guards, access controls that required badge authentication rather than the previous open-door policy. The changes were presented as part of the facility's evolution into a premier research institution, nothing that would raise suspicions or seem targeted at protecting one specific employee. The apartment transfer was handled through the facility's HR department, presented as corporate housing being offered to valued researchers who'd shown exceptional dedication. Harriet's director called her in and offered the upgrade personally, praising her work and nodding that the new space would better accommodate her family situation. According to the surveillance reports Malchin received, Harriet had been suspicious at first, questioning why she was being singled out for this benefit. But the director had been well coached, explaining that several researchers were being offered similar arrangements, that the company was trying to improve retention by providing better work-life balance support. The apartment was in a modern building with actual security, located closer to the facility and to better schools, with 3 bedrooms instead of the cramped studio where she'd been raising the triplets. The rent was presented as subsidized corporate housing, a fraction of what she'd been paying, giving her breathing room in a budget that Jaiwoo's reports suggested had been stretched beyond reasonable limits. Harriet accepted after 3 days of deliberation, probably because refusing would have seemed ungrateful, and because the practical advantages were too significant to dismiss based on vague suspicions. The move happened over a weekend, and Malchin watched the surveillance footage of her directing movers and settling the children into a space that actually had room for them to play. Owen immediately claimed the largest bedroom, Felix carefully arranged his books in the second room, and Iris spun in circles in the living area, delighted by the space. Harriet stood in the kitchen, an actual kitchen with full appliances and counter space, and Malchin saw her expression crack briefly, showing something that might have been relief or might have been the exhaustion of someone who'd been holding everything together through pure force of will and could finally, marginally, relax. The Choi surveillance continued for another week before apparently concluding that the researcher had no significant connection to the Hyun organization, that the security upgrades at the facility made infiltration more trouble than it was worth, that this particular avenue of intelligence gathering had proven unproductive. The threat level dropped from immediate to routine monitoring, and Malchin allowed himself to breathe for the first time in days. Yujin found him in his office reviewing the latest reports and commented that the children were safer now, that Harriet's financial pressure had been marginally reduced, that he'd managed to provide basic protection without completely destroying what remained of his character. Her tone suggested this was the minimum acceptable standard, rather than something deserving praise. Malchin asked if she thought Harriet suspected his involvement. Yujin said probably that the woman wasn't stupid, that the timing of these benefits immediately after their encounter at the gala was suspicious enough to raise questions. But she'd likely accepted the help anyway, because refusing would have meant continuing to struggle while her children paid the price for her pride. Which made her, Yujin observed with cutting precision, a better parent than Malchin had ever been, because she put her children's needs ahead of her own feelings. The observation sat in Malchin's chest like a stone, heavy and immovable, and absolutely true. The decision to dismantle the empire didn't come as a sudden revelation, but as a slow erosion of certainty that had been building since the moment Malchin saw those crescent birthmarks. Every meeting with associates who profited from violence, every transaction that involved blood money, every strategic decision that prioritized power over human cost, all of it began to feel like building a legacy his children would either be forced to inherit or spend their lives running from. He stood in his office late one night, reviewing financial reports that detailed the syndicate's expanding operations, and realized with absolute clarity that he was constructing a prison for 3 people who'd never asked to be born into this world. Owen, Felix, and Iris would grow up with the Hyun name attached to them whether they knew it or not, would eventually learn that their father was a criminal whose empire was built on extortion and smuggling, and the kind of violence that left bodies in alleys. They would have to choose, someday, between embracing that legacy or rejecting it entirely, between following in his footsteps or spending their lives trying to escape his shadow. And the thought of Owen's fierce determination being channeled into violence, of Felix's careful observation being used to identify vulnerabilities for exploitation, of Iris's joy being extinguished by the weight of what their bloodline demanded, it made everything he'd built feel like ash. His father's voice echoed in his memory, lessons drilled into him from childhood about power being the only thing that mattered, about sentiment being weakness, about the Hyun legacy requiring sacrifice of personal desires for the greater strength of the organization. He'd internalized those teachings so completely that they'd become his operating system, the foundational code that governed every decision. But his father had been wrong about what mattered, wrong about what constituted strength, wrong about everything that actually made a life worth living. The realization should have felt like betrayal of everything he'd been raised to value. Instead, it felt like liberation from a burden he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was optional. The practical challenges of dismantling a criminal empire were substantial and dangerous. He couldn't simply announce his retirement without creating a power vacuum that would trigger immediate violence as rivals and subordinates fought to fill the void. He couldn't liquidate assets without raising suspicions that would make him vulnerable to enemies who saw transition periods as opportunities for elimination. He couldn't abandon the organization without ensuring that the people who depended on it, the legitimate employees, the families supported by protection money, the communities where Hyun influence maintained a certain brutal stability, wouldn't be left to predatory chaos. He needed a strategy, a careful dismantling that would look like evolution rather than abandonment, that would transfer power without triggering the kind of bloodshed that always accompanied perceived weakness. The first conversation was with Yujin, because their marriage gave her family claim to significant portions of the combined operations, and because she'd already demonstrated she could separate sentiment from strategy. He found her in the penthouse library, reading a book she'd probably chosen, because it made her look sophisticated rather than because she had any actual interest in its contents. He said he was considering transitioning the organization toward legitimate operations, phasing out the criminal enterprises over time, that he wanted to know if her family would support or oppose this direction. Yujin set down her book and studied him with the kind of assessment she usually reserved for business negotiations. She asked what had prompted this sudden interest in legality, her tone making clear she already knew the answer. Malchin saw no point in denying it. He said he didn't want his children growing up with the Hyun name being synonymous with criminal activity, that he didn't want them inheriting a legacy that would destroy them or force them into lives they hadn't chosen. Yoojin's expression shifted into something that might have been respect if she were capable of such straightforward emotion. She said her family had been considering similar transitions for years, that criminal enterprises were becoming increasingly risky as law enforcement improved and international cooperation made traditional operations more difficult. The real money was in legitimate business anyway: real estate, technology, financial services, and the political connections they'd cultivated could be just as valuable in legal contexts as they were in criminal ones. If Malchin wanted to clean up the Hyun operations, her family would support the transition in exchange for favorable terms on the legitimate businesses that would replace the criminal ones. It was still about power and profit, just with different methods and fewer bodies. The agreement was characteristically transactional, but it provided the foundation he needed to begin the process without immediately becoming a target. The second conversation was with Sang-uk, whose loyalty to the organization had been absolute for a decade, but whose intelligence background meant he understood strategy beyond simple violence. Malchin laid out a 5-year plan that would gradually transition Hyun operations into legitimate territory, consolidating the criminal enterprises into manageable units that could be sold or shut down while building up legal businesses that would provide sustainable revenue. Sang-uk listened without interruption, his expression giving away nothing, and when Malchin finished, he asked the question that mattered most. What happened to the people who depended on the current structure? The soldiers and enforcers and street-level operators whose skills didn't translate to legitimate business. Malchin said they would be offered positions in the legal operations where possible, given severance packages where not, and strongly encouraged to find employment that didn't involve criminal activity. The organization would help with job placement, with training for new skills, with ensuring that the transition didn't leave loyal people destitute. It was more generous than most syndicate leaders would consider, probably more than the people deserved. But Malchin had spent 3 years making decisions based purely on strategic advantage, and he was done letting other people pay the price for his choices. Sang-uk considered this for a long moment before nodding. He said he would support the transition, would help identify which operations could be legitimized and which needed to be shut down, would use his intelligence network to ensure the process didn't create vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Then he asked if this was about the woman and children in Incheon, his tone suggesting he'd already figured out the connection and was just waiting for confirmation. Malchin said yes, it was about them. About not wanting his children to grow up afraid of what their father had built, about wanting them to have choices he'd never had. Sang-uk's expression softened marginally. He said his own daughter was about the same age as the triplets, that he understood making decisions based on what kind of world you wanted to leave for your children, that it was probably the only reason that actually mattered in the end. The transition began slowly, carefully, with strategic decisions that looked like business evolution rather than fundamental change. The weapons trafficking operation was sold to a European syndicate for a sum that made the accountants nervous about how to launder it properly. The protection rackets were gradually reduced, payments decreased, and then eliminated as legitimate security companies were established to replace them. The smuggling networks were redirected toward legal import-export businesses, the same routes and connections used for legitimate goods. Some of the older associates resisted, arguing that Malchin was showing weakness, that his father would have never abandoned the foundations that made the Hyun name feared across Asia. They complained to Yoojin's father, trying to build opposition to the changes, but they'd miscalculated how much support the transition actually had among people tired of looking over their shoulders for law enforcement or rival syndicates. The complaints were noted and ignored, and 2 of the most vocal opponents found themselves quietly retired with generous pensions that came with the understanding that continued objections would be very bad for their health. The message was received. The transition continued. Malchin threw himself into the work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, spending 18-hour days restructuring operations, negotiating with business partners, establishing legitimate corporate structures to replace criminal ones. He met with lawyers who specialized in helping organizations go straight, with accountants who knew how to clean dirty money through legal channels, with consultants who understood how to transition a workforce from criminal operations to legitimate business. Yoo-jin participated more than he'd expected, her business acumen proving valuable as they navigated the complex process of legitimization. She seemed to enjoy the challenge, approaching it like an elaborate puzzle that required both creativity and ruthless efficiency. They worked together more during this period than they had in their entire marriage, and while it wasn't partnership in any emotional sense, it was effective collaboration toward a shared goal. The hardest part was accepting how much he'd lost with the children, how the years of their early childhood had passed, while he'd been building an empire they would have been better off never knowing about. Jae-woo's surveillance reports showed him fragments of their lives. Owen's first day at the new preschool near Harriet's upgraded apartment, Felix's careful attention to story time at the library, Iris's delight at a community festival where she'd won a goldfish in a game. He'd missed all of it. He'd missed the first words and first steps and all the small moments that made up the actual substance of their existence. He'd been too busy consolidating power and expanding territories and making strategic decisions that felt increasingly meaningless compared to what he'd sacrificed. The surveillance showed Harriet too, her exhaustion marginally reduced by the better living situation, but still present in the slope of her shoulders, the careful budgeting he could see in how she shopped for groceries, the way she worked on her research late at night after the children were asleep. She was managing, surviving, even occasionally thriving, but always alone, carrying the entire weight of their existence without help or support or acknowledgement that she was doing the impossible. 6 months into the transition, Mal-chin made a decision that would have been unthinkable under his father's leadership. He established a legitimate trust fund for the children, structured through shell corporations and legal mechanisms that obscured the source, but ensured they would have resources for education, healthcare, and whatever future they chose. The funding was substantial enough to eliminate financial pressure from Harriet's life, without being so excessive that it would raise immediate suspicions about its origin. The trust was managed through Yoo-jin's family's legitimate corporate structure, presented as a medical research grant that included family support for valued employees who'd shown exceptional dedication. Harriet would receive quarterly statements showing the trust's value and the funds available for the children's needs, but the paperwork would be sufficiently complex that tracing it back to Mal-chin would require investigation she had neither the time nor resources to pursue. Yoo-jin handled the implementation personally, and when it was done, she told Mal-chin that he'd managed to provide for his children without completely contaminating them with his criminal history, which was probably the best he could have hoped for given how badly he'd failed them initially. The assessment was harsh but accurate, and he accepted it without argument. A year into the transition, the Hyun organization was almost unrecognizable from what it had been. The criminal operations had been reduced to a fraction of their former scope, mostly legacy connections that were being slowly dissolved as legal alternatives took their place. The legitimate businesses were profitable and growing, real estate developments and technology investments, and financial services that generated wealth without requiring violence. Mal-chin's reputation evolved from feared syndicate boss to ruthless businessman, which was probably an accurate assessment of his character regardless of the context. The violence decreased significantly, though he kept enough security infrastructure to protect against rivals who might see the transition as vulnerability. The changes rippled through the organization in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. Families who'd been supported by criminal enterprises found more stable employment in legitimate businesses. Communities that had existed under protection rackets discovered they could operate without paying tribute to criminal organizations. The constant threat of violence that had characterized life in Hyun territories diminished, replaced by the more mundane pressures of regular business competition. It wasn't perfect. Some people were worse off after the transition, their skills too specialized in violence to translate to legitimate work. Some communities lost the brutal stability that had kept other predators away. But on balance, the world was marginally better for the changes, and Malchin's children would grow up with a father whose name appeared in business sections rather than crime reports. He stood in his office late one night, reviewing the quarterly reports that showed the legitimate businesses thriving, and allowed himself a moment of something that might have been satisfaction. He'd dismantled his father's legacy, had chosen his children's future over his past, had proven that change was possible even for someone as compromised as he was. It didn't erase the 3 years he'd missed. It didn't excuse the choice he'd made in that office when Harriet stood before him pregnant and terrified. It didn't make him deserving of the children who carried his birthmark and his genetic legacy. But it was a start, the beginning of building something worth inheriting rather than something his children would spend their lives trying to escape. The first step toward actual fatherhood came 18 months after Malchin had seen the birthmarks, after the empire had been sufficiently dismantled that his presence in the children's lives wouldn't automatically endanger them, after he'd exhausted every indirect method of providing support and realized that proximity was the only thing that actually mattered. He couldn't approach Harriet directly. The barriers between them were built from justified anger and 3 years of abandonment, fortifications that wouldn't fall just because he'd finally decided to acknowledge his responsibilities. But he could create circumstances where their paths crossed naturally, where his presence became familiar rather than threatening, where he could demonstrate through consistent action rather than empty words that he'd fundamentally changed. The opportunity came through the research facility where Harriet worked. The legitimate businesses Malchin had built included a medical technology company that specialized in pediatric equipment, and that company was seeking partnerships with research institutions for product development and clinical trials. The facility where Harriet conducted her cardiac research was an obvious candidate for collaboration, and Malchin personally led the negotiation meetings. Harriet was included in the discussions because her research was directly relevant to the equipment being developed. She sat across the conference table from him during the first meeting, her expression professionally neutral but her posture radiating tension. She spoke when addressed, answered questions about her research protocols with clinical precision, and avoided looking directly at him whenever possible. The meetings became weekly occurrences, ostensibly to coordinate the research partnership, but actually serving as Malchin's only legitimate excuse to be in the same room with her. He kept his contributions professional, asking informed questions about the research, offering resources that would genuinely benefit her work, never referencing their history or the children or anything that would cross the boundary from business into personal territory. After the third meeting, Harriet waited until everyone else had left before confronting him in the empty conference room. She asked what he was doing, her voice controlled but her eyes showing the anger she'd been suppressing for weeks. He said he was establishing a research partnership that benefited both organizations, which was technically true even if it wasn't the complete truth. She said she wasn't stupid, that she knew the sudden interest in her specific research wasn't coincidental, that the apartment upgrade and the trust fund, and now these meetings all pointed to involvement she'd never asked for and didn't want. Malchin met her anger without deflection, without the manipulation tactics that served him in business. He said she was right, that none of it was coincidental, that he'd been trying to help in the only ways he could without making things worse. Harriet's laugh was bitter and sharp. She asked if he thought money fixed anything, if he believed providing resources somehow compensated for 3 years of absence, if he had any idea what it had been like to raise his children alone while he'd been living in luxury. He said no, it didn't fix anything, and yes, he knew exactly what it had been like because he'd been watching from a distance like a coward who couldn't face what he'd done. The admission seemed to surprise her, breaking through her anger enough to reveal the exhaustion beneath it. She asked what he wanted from her, from the children, what endgame justified all this careful maneuvering. He said he wanted to know them, to be part of their lives in whatever capacity she would allow, that he understood he had no right to ask for anything, but he was asking anyway because the alternative was spending the rest of his life knowing his children existed, and being absent from everything that mattered. Harriet was silent for a long moment, studying him with an assessment that felt like being dissected. She asked if he was still married to the woman from the gala, if this sudden interest in fatherhood was some kind of midlife crisis or guilt-driven impulse that would evaporate when it became inconvenient. He explained about the marriage, about how it had always been a business arrangement, about how Yoo-jin actually supported his involvement with the children because she understood the strategic value of stability. He explained about dismantling the criminal empire, about building legitimate businesses so the children wouldn't inherit a legacy of violence. Harriet listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said that changing his business model didn't change what he'd done, didn't erase the choice he'd made when she'd stood in his office carrying his children, and he'd offered her money to make them disappear. He agreed completely. Nothing erased that choice. Nothing excused it. But he was asking for the opportunity to prove through sustained action that he'd learned from it, that he could become someone worthy of knowing those children even if he would never be worthy of her forgiveness. She told him to leave, that she needed time to think, that this conversation was over. He left without argument, and the weekly meetings continued with the same professional distance, neither of them acknowledging what had been said in the empty conference room. 3 weeks later, Harriet sent him a message through the facility's administrative system. It said she would allow supervised visits, 1 hour per week at a public location, with clear boundaries and the understanding that any behavior that upset the children or made them uncomfortable would result in immediate termination of all contact. The terms were harsh but fair, exactly what he deserved, and he accepted them without negotiation. The first visit was at a children's museum near Harriet's apartment, a sprawling space full of interactive exhibits where children ran and played, while parents followed at a distance. Harriet arrived with the triplets, and Mal-chin saw them up close for the first time since that day at the playground when he discovered the birthmarks. Owen was taller than his siblings, already showing signs of the height that ran in the Hyun bloodline. He regarded Mal-chin with open suspicion, a 4-year-old's instinct for stranger danger combined with something that looked like protectiveness toward his mother. Felix hung back, watching everything with the careful observation Mal-chin recognized from surveillance reports, processing and analyzing before committing to any interaction. Iris smiled at him with the kind of openness that made his chest ache, a child who hadn't yet learned to guard herself against disappointment. Harriet made brief introductions, telling the children that this was Mr. Hyun and he would be spending some time with them today. She didn't mention the relationship, didn't explain why this stranger was suddenly part of their Saturday, just presented it as a fact and waited to see how they would respond. Owen asked why, with the blunt directness of a child who hadn't learned about social niceties. Harriet said because Mr. Hyun was interested in learning about the things they liked, which was technically true if wildly incomplete. Mal-chin spent the first half hour feeling completely out of his depth, following the children through exhibits while they ran and climbed and explored with the boundless energy of 4-year-olds. He had no idea how to interact with them, no frame of reference for communicating with people this young, no skills beyond business negotiation and strategic thinking. Owen tested him immediately, demanding that Mal-chin help build something in the construction area and then criticizing every piece he placed. Felix watched the interaction from a distance, offering occasional suggestions that revealed he'd been observing the entire time. Iris brought him a book about butterflies and asked him to read it, apparently unconcerned about whether he was trustworthy enough to deserve such attention. He read the book haltingly, stumbling over scientific names and trying to make the narrative engaging despite having no experience with children's literature. Iris listened with rapt attention, asking questions about every page, her curiosity apparently endless. Harriet watched from nearby, her expression unreadable but her posture showing she was ready to intervene if needed. The hour ended too quickly, and when Harriet said it was time to leave, Owen seemed relieved, Felix seemed thoughtful, and Iris asked when Mr. Hyun would visit again. The second visit went slightly better. Malchin brought books he'd researched online as being appropriate for 4-year-olds, stories about animals and adventures and friendship. Iris claimed all of them immediately, while Owen grudgingly admitted that one about dragons was acceptable. Felix asked if Malchin knew any real stories, not from books, about things that had actually happened. Malchin told them about traveling to different countries, carefully editing out anything related to criminal activity, focusing on cultural differences and interesting food and the experience of being places where nobody spoke Korean. The children listened with varying degrees of attention, and something that felt like actual connection flickered briefly in the space between them. The visits became routine over the following months, every Saturday morning at the museum or the aquarium or the botanical gardens, places where children could be children and Malchin could learn the specific textures of their personalities. Owen's fierce protectiveness extended to his siblings, immediately defending them against any perceived threat. Felix's observation skills were remarkable, noticing details adults missed and asking questions that revealed sophisticated thinking. Iris's joy was infectious, finding delight in everything from fish tanks to flower displays. Malchin studied them the way he'd once studied business competitors, learning their patterns and preferences and the specific things that made each of them unique. Owen liked physical challenges, climbing and running and testing his limits. Felix liked puzzles and problems, anything that required careful thought and systematic approach. Iris liked stories and art and anything involving imagination. He started bringing small gifts tailored to their interests, a climbing rope and harness set for Owen, logic puzzles for Felix, art supplies for Iris. Harriet initially objected to the gifts, saying he was trying to buy affection, but he explained he was simply trying to support their interests the way any involved parent would. She didn't call him a parent, but she stopped objecting to the gifts. The breakthrough came 4 months into the visits, at the aquarium where they'd gone to see a special jellyfish exhibit. Owen had been having a difficult morning, frustrated about something at preschool, taking out his anger on everyone around him. He'd snapped at Felix, pushed past Iris, and refused to engage with any of the exhibits. Malchin recognized the behavior because he'd been exactly the same as a child, frustrated and angry, and unable to articulate what was wrong. His father had responded to such moods with punishment and lectures about control, which had only driven the emotions deeper and taught him that feelings were weaknesses to be hidden. He knelt down to Owen's level, meeting the boy's furious gaze, and said that sometimes everything felt wrong and you didn't know how to fix it. That anger was okay, but taking it out on people who cared about you wasn't. Owen's eyes filled with tears he was fighting not to shed, and Malchin said it was also okay to cry when things were hard, that being strong didn't mean never having feelings. The dam broke, and Owen collapsed against him sobbing, 4 years of being the tough oldest sibling apparently released in a moment of permission. Malchin held him awkwardly, uncertain about the mechanics of comfort, but knowing that presence mattered more than technique. Harriet watched from a distance, her expression showing something that might have been surprise or might have been the first hint of reconsidering her assessment of his capacity for actual fatherhood. After that, the visits felt different. The children began to anticipate them, asking Harriet during the week when they would see Mr. Hyun again. Owen started saving things to show him, drawings from school, rocks he'd found that had interesting shapes. Felix began asking him questions about business and how things worked, his curiosity apparently extending to understanding adult worlds. Iris started calling him Uncle Hyun without prompting, a title that wasn't accurate but felt more real than the formal distance of his surname. Malchin expanded the visits when Harriet allowed it, taking the children to activities she couldn't afford on her researcher's salary. A children's cooking class where Owen learned he liked following precise instructions, Felix discovered an interest in how ingredients combined to create new flavors, and Iris made a mess, but had the time of her life. A science museum with hands-on experiments that Felix found endlessly fascinating. An indoor climbing gym where Owen could safely test his physical limits, while Malchin spotted him and learned about being present for someone else's achievements. He learned their routines, their preferences for bedtime stories, the specific ways they liked their food prepared. He learned that Owen needed warnings before transitions, that Felix needed time to process new information before responding, that Iris needed physical affection and constant reassurance that people weren't going to leave. That last one destroyed him every time, knowing that her need for reassurance came from some instinctive understanding that their family structure wasn't typical, that other children had fathers who were present rather than appearing for scheduled visits. He started helping with practical things when Harriet allowed it, picking up the children from preschool when she had late meetings, taking them to medical appointments so she could work uninterrupted, teaching Owen to ride a bicycle with training wheels, running alongside until the boy found his balance, reading to Felix at bedtime, enduring the child's endless questions about plot logic and character motivation, braiding Iris's hair in the mornings, learning the technique through online videos because she'd asked, and he couldn't bear to disappoint her. The mundane tasks of parenting that he'd never considered, grocery shopping with 3 children who all wanted different things, negotiating about screen time limits, explaining why hitting wasn't acceptable even when you were angry, became the actual substance of his existence in ways that running an empire never had. Harriet maintained her boundaries, never allowing him into the apartment when she was alone, never suggesting that his presence was anything beyond the supervised access she'd granted. But her hostility softened into something closer to wary coexistence, occasionally asking his opinion about decisions regarding the children, sometimes even accepting his suggestions about handling behavioral issues. A year into the visits, the children started referring to him as their father without prompting, the title emerging naturally from their understanding rather than anything Harriet or Malchin had explicitly stated. Owen announced it matter-of-factly at the climbing gym, telling another child that his father was helping him. Felix included it in a school project about family, listing father, Hyun Malchin, businessman, alongside information about Harriet. Iris drew a picture of their family that included 5 figures, and when Harriet asked who the 5th person was, she said, "Obviously my dad," as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Harriet showed him the drawing during a rare moment when they were alone, the children occupied with a movie in another room. She said she hadn't told them, hadn't explained the relationship, but children understood more than adults gave them credit for. Malchin studied the crayon drawing, seeing himself rendered in Iris's enthusiastic but inaccurate style, and felt something shift in his chest that might have been the closest he'd ever come to actual happiness. He asked Harriet if she minded them claiming him as their father. If it complicated things, she'd rather keep simple. She was quiet for a moment before saying that what she minded was that it had taken him 4 years to become the person he should have been from the beginning, but that the children deserved to have a father who showed up and tried and learned how to be better. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement, and for now, that was enough. The beach trip was Iris's idea, voiced during one of the Saturday visits when she'd been looking through a book about ocean animals, and declared with absolute certainty that they needed to see real waves, not just pictures. Owen had immediately supported the plan because it involved potential for adventure and physical activity. Felix had asked logical questions about distance and timing, and whether the weather would cooperate, but his interest was clear beneath the practical concerns. Malchin had looked at Harriet, waiting for her to dismiss the idea or set boundaries around it, but instead she'd surprised him by saying that a day trip to the coast might be good for all of them, that the children had never actually seen the ocean despite living in a coastal country. The admission had hit him harder than it should have, another reminder of everything Harriet had been unable to provide while working multiple jobs and raising 3 children alone, another piece of normal childhood experience that had been sacrificed to the circumstances he'd created. So he'd planned the trip with the kind of meticulous attention he'd once reserved for criminal operations, researching family-friendly beaches within reasonable driving distance, checking weather forecasts obsessively, arranging for a vehicle large enough to accommodate 5 people comfortably. He'd consulted online forums about what children needed for beach visits, purchasing equipment he'd never considered, sand toys and sun protection, and inflatable flotation devices in triplicate, because the children would inevitably argue about sharing. Yujin had observed his preparations with something that looked like amusement, commenting that he was approaching a beach trip with the same intensity most people reserved for military campaigns. He'd acknowledged the accuracy of the assessment without apology, explaining that he had no frame of reference for this kind of family activity and was compensating for inexperience with excessive planning. She'd told him he was overthinking it, that children didn't care about perfect planning, that showing up and being present mattered more than having the right equipment. Then she'd handed him a beach umbrella from storage and said her family used to do coastal trips when she was young, before business had consumed everything, and she remembered those days as some of the only genuinely happy moments of her childhood. The vulnerability had surprised him, coming from someone who usually maintained such careful emotional distance. He'd thanked her for the umbrella and the advice, and she'd returned to her usual detachment as though the moment of honesty had never happened. The morning of the trip arrived with perfect weather, clear skies and moderate temperatures and forecasts promising calm seas. Malchin picked up Harriet and the children at dawn, the early start necessary to beat traffic and give them maximum time at the beach. The children were vibrating with excitement, piling into the vehicle with their bags and immediately asking how long the drive would take. Harriet settled into the passenger seat with visible exhaustion, and Malchin realized this was probably the first time in years she'd been able to sit still, while someone else handled logistics and navigation. She'd brought snacks in containers that had been carefully portioned, drinks in reusable bottles, a first aid kit that looked like it had been assembled from years of experience with minor childhood injuries. The drive took 90 minutes through countryside that gradually shifted from urban density to rural farmland to coastal villages. The children kept up a constant stream of chatter, pointing out things through the windows, arguing about who had seen what first, asking questions about everything they passed. Owen wanted to know why some buildings were old and others new. Felix wanted to understand how bridges worked and whether the one they were crossing could support the weight of all the cars. Iris made up stories about the people in other vehicles, imagining elaborate lives and adventures for strangers they would never meet. Malchin answered what questions he could and admitted ignorance when he didn't know, which seemed to satisfy the children more than inventing answers would have. Harriet occasionally corrected his explanations or provided additional context, falling into an easy rhythm of collaborative parenting that felt simultaneously natural and fragile. They arrived at the beach mid-morning, the parking area already half full with other families beginning their weekend escapes. Malchin had chosen a location known for gentle waves and shallow water, safe for young children who'd never experienced ocean swimming. He carried most of the equipment while Harriet managed the children, the division of labor unspoken but effective. The moment the children saw the expanse of water stretching to the horizon, something shifted in their energy. Owen took off running toward the waves before Harriet could stop him, his shout of excitement carrying back to them on the ocean breeze. Felix followed more cautiously, stopping at the edge where water met sand to observe the wave patterns. Iris grabbed Malchin's hand and pulled him forward, her urgency suggesting she feared the ocean might disappear if they didn't reach it immediately. Harriet called after Owen to wait, to stay where she could see him, her voice carrying the constant low-level anxiety of a parent responsible for keeping small humans alive in an environment full of potential dangers. Malchin caught up to Owen and established boundaries about how far into the water he could go, the negotiation familiar from months of learning how to set limits the boy would actually respect. They spent the next hour simply playing in the shallow water, the children discovering that waves were both thrilling and slightly frightening, that sand felt different when wet, that the ocean tasted terrible if you accidentally got water in your mouth. Owen immediately began testing the limits, going deeper than allowed until Malchin had to physically retrieve him. Felix studied the way water moved around his legs, conducting small experiments by changing his stance and observing how it affected the wave's impact. Iris collected shells and presented each one to Harriet or Malchin with detailed explanations of why it was special. Harriet waded in up to her knees, her dress hiked up and her professional demeanor completely abandoned as she laughed at the children's discoveries and warned them about going too deep. Malchin watched her relaxation, seeing glimpses of who she might have been if the past 4 years had been different, if she'd had support instead of struggle, if her relationship with him had been anything other than catastrophic. They took a break for lunch under the umbrella Malchin had set up, the children devouring sandwiches Harriet had prepared while comparing their morning's shell collections and arguing about whose were better. Owen declared he'd found 17 shells, though actual counting revealed only 9. Felix had organized his by type, explaining a classification system he'd apparently invented. Iris had given all of hers names and personalities, and was explaining their relationships with the seriousness of a child who fully believed in her created narrative. After lunch, Malchin taught Owen and Felix to build sandcastles, following instructions from a website he'd consulted earlier. The boys approached the task with characteristic intensity, Owen building aggressively and Felix carefully engineering structural integrity. Iris mostly just enjoyed the sensory experience of wet sand, creating abstract sculptures she declared were modern art. Harriet sat nearby, reading a book she'd brought but mostly watching them work, her expression carrying something that looked like contentment. Malchin caught her eye at one point and found himself unable to look away, the moment stretching between them loaded with everything unspoken. She asked quietly if he'd imagined this when he'd made his choice in that office 4 years ago, if he'd pictured what he was giving up. He said honestly that he hadn't imagined anything beyond making the problem disappear, that he'd been incapable of seeing past his own fear and ego to recognize what was actually being offered. She nodded slowly, returning her attention to the book but not actually reading. After a moment, she said that she'd spent a long time hating him, that it had been easier than accepting that she'd trusted someone who'd proven himself unworthy of it. He told her she had every right to that hatred, that he'd earned it thoroughly and couldn't ask her to let it go. She was quiet for so long he thought the conversation was over, but then she said something had shifted over the past year, watching him show up consistently for the children, seeing him learn to be better even when it was difficult. She still didn't forgive him for the initial choice, probably never would completely, but she was starting to believe his change was real rather than performance. The acknowledgement felt like more than he deserved, and he said so. Harriet smiled without humor and told him that what he deserved was irrelevant compared to what the children needed, that she was allowing his presence because it benefited them, not because he'd somehow earned redemption. The honesty was sharp, but fair, exactly what he needed to hear to maintain perspective on his position in their lives. The afternoon passed in cycles of water play and rest, the children's energy seemingly infinite despite the physical demands of beach activities. Owen discovered body surfing, or his 4-year-old approximation of it, throwing himself into small waves with reckless enthusiasm. Felix found a tide pool and spent an hour observing the small creatures living in it, asking questions about their behavior that neither Harriet nor Malchin could answer definitively. Iris convinced Malchin to help her build an elaborate sand sculpture that she claimed was a palace for mermaids, complete with towers and moats and decorative shell arrangements. As the afternoon shifted toward evening, the beach began to empty as other families packed up and headed home. Harriet suggested they stay for sunset since they'd come all this way, and nobody objected. Malchin ordered food from a nearby restaurant, having it delivered to the beach, fish and chips that the children devoured while sitting on the sand and watching the sky begin to change colors. The sunset was spectacular, the kind of display that seemed almost too perfect to be real. The sky shifted through shades of orange and pink and purple while the sun descended toward the horizon, turning the water into liquid gold. The children were finally quiet, tired from the day's activities and mesmerized by the visual spectacle. Iris leaned against Malchin's side, her small body heavy with exhaustion. Felix sat next to Harriet, his analytical mind apparently taking a break to simply experience beauty without needing to understand it. Owen remained standing, watching the sunset with uncharacteristic stillness, perhaps recognizing that some moments demanded reverence rather than action. Harriet reached over and took Malchin's hand, the gesture so unexpected he almost flinched. She didn't look at him, keeping her attention on the sunset, but her fingers intertwined with his in a way that felt like forgiveness even if she hadn't offered the words. He squeezed her hand gently, acknowledging the gift she was giving him, the possibility of something beyond supervised visits and careful boundaries. Owen turned from the sunset and looked at the four of them sitting together. He asked with the blunt directness that characterized everything he said whether this meant they were a real family now, or if it was still just pretend. The question hung in the air, while Harriet and Malchin looked at each other, both recognizing that the answer would define everything that came after. Harriet spoke first, telling Owen that they were a family, that families could look different from what books and TV showed, that what mattered was people choosing to care about each other even when it was hard. Owen seemed satisfied with this, returning his attention to the sunset. Felix nodded thoughtfully, processing the information in his systematic way. Iris didn't seem to have any questions, already having decided they were a family regardless of what adults said about it. Malchin found his voice enough to add that he knew he'd failed them initially, that he'd made terrible choices that had hurt everyone, but that he was committed to being better, to being present, to being the father they deserved even if it took the rest of his life to earn that title. The children accepted this with the easy forgiveness of people too young to understand the full weight of adult failures. They returned to watching the sunset, comfortable with the resolution they'd been given, ready to move forward into whatever came next. The sun finally sank below the horizon, leaving behind a sky full of fading colors. Malchin helped pack up their equipment while Harriet gathered the exhausted children, loading everything back into the vehicle for the drive home. The children fell asleep within minutes, their bodies giving up after a day of unprecedented adventure. Harriet stayed awake, her gaze fixed on the darkening landscape passing by the windows. She said quietly that she'd spent so long being angry, so long carrying everything alone, that she wasn't sure how to let someone help even when she wanted to. Malchin told her she didn't have to figure it out all at once, that they could take it slowly, that he would be patient for however long it took, because she'd already been patient with him far beyond what was reasonable. She smiled slightly, the expression tired but genuine. She said she still had nightmares about that day in his office, about standing there pregnant and terrified while he turned his back, but that memories were starting to compete with new experiences of him being present and trying, and occasionally even succeeding at fatherhood. He said he had nightmares too, about all the moments he'd missed, about the 3 years when his children existed and he'd chosen to remain absent. But he was learning that dwelling in past failures accomplished nothing compared to showing up for present moments and building toward a future that might eventually balance the scales. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the road empty and dark except for their headlights cutting through the night. When they finally reached Harriet's apartment, Malchin helped carry the sleeping children upstairs, settling them into their beds while Harriet gathered their sandy clothes and started the practical work of cleaning up after their adventure. She walked him to the door when he was ready to leave, standing in the doorway while he lingered in the hallway. She said thank you for today, that the children would remember it forever, that it was exactly the kind of memory she'd wanted to give them but hadn't been able to create alone. He said he should be thanking her for allowing him to be part of it, for giving him chances he didn't deserve, for being better than he'd ever been even when it cost her everything. She stepped forward and kissed him briefly, not passionately but with intention, a gesture that suggested possibility rather than conclusion. When she pulled back, she said they should probably talk about what they were becoming to each other, that she needed time to process whether she could trust him with her heart the way she'd learned to trust him with the children. He agreed completely, saying he would wait for however long she needed, that earning her trust was more important than any timeline or expectation. She smiled and told him good night, closing the door gently while he stood in the hallway trying to process what had just happened. The drive back to the empty penthouse felt different than previous returns. The silence wasn't oppressive, but contemplative, space to think about what the day had meant, what the future might hold, what kind of person he was becoming through the steady work of showing up and trying and learning to put other people's needs ahead of his own comfort. Yoo-jin was awake when he arrived, sitting in the living room with a glass of wine and a book. She asked how the beach trip went, her tone suggesting genuine interest rather than polite inquiry. He told her it had been perfect, that the children had loved it, that Harriet had seemed happier than he'd ever seen her, that he felt like maybe, finally, he was building something worth more than all the power and wealth he'd once valued above everything else. Yoo-jin studied him for a moment before saying that he'd changed significantly over the past 2 years, that the man who'd married her for strategic advantage barely resembled the person sitting in front of her talking about children's beach memories and earned trust. He acknowledged the transformation, admitting he barely recognized himself anymore, that fatherhood had revealed how hollow his previous priorities had been. Yoo-jin said she was glad that maybe they'd both learned something from the arrangement that had brought them together, that growth was possible even in the most unlikely circumstances. They sat together in companionable silence, two people who'd entered a strategic marriage and somehow ended up supporting each other's evolution into better versions of themselves. Mal-chin thought about the sunset, about Harriet's hand in his, about 3 children sleeping peacefully because they'd spent the day being loved and valued and given experiences that built happy memories. He thought about how far he'd come from the man who'd stood with his back, turned, and called those same children a problem to be solved. Power meant nothing without family. Wealth meant nothing without people to share it with. Success meant nothing if it came at the cost of the relationships that actually made life worth living. He'd finally learned what mattered, and though the lesson had cost him years he could never recover, the future stretched ahead full of possibility for becoming the person his children needed, the partner Harriet might eventually trust, the man he should have been from the beginning. The past was painful and permanent, marked by choices that couldn't be undone. But the future belonged to all of them, ready to be written through consistent presence and patient love and the steady work of redemption.